The Clone Wars raged all across the galaxy, bringing the soldiers of the Grand Army of the Republic to a wide variety of alien worlds. Of all these battlefronts, one of the most infamous, and certainly the most hellish, was Felucia, the headquarters and stronghold of the Commerce Guild. Several battles were fought on this planet over the course of the war, and each of them was brutal, not just due to the fierceness of the fighting, but also due to Felucia's environment. This was a planet like no other. A jungle of fungi and gelatinous alien creatures, full of flesh-eating diseases and shrieking monsters, and in this video, we'll be examining it in detail, delving into aspects of its biosphere, cultures, and history that even the most obsessive Clone Wars fans probably aren't aware of.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Felucia was located in the Felucia system of the Thanium sector, which lay in the Trans-Hydian region of the Outer Rim territories. The Thanium sector was a knot of commercial and minor industrial worlds on the edge of the Greater Tyon cluster, located close to the Polemian trade route, which allowed these worlds to receive regular trade from the greater galaxy. As a peripheral region of the Tyon cluster, the Thanium sector, and Felucia with it, had a long history, and it had been Republic territory for over 20,000 years by the time of the Clone Wars. However, for nearly all that time, the Thanium sector was part of the Republic's far frontier, a buffer zone between the Polemian and a swath of unexplored space, thick with pirates, slavers, and Sith. That region was finally explored sometime between 3000 and 2000 BBY, but it remained largely desolate, a backwater with very few settled worlds. The Sith were gone, but the region was still prowled by pirates and slavers. As a result, the outer parts of the Thanium sector were still more or less frontier space. They had been on the star charts for a long time and were in a part of space that was pretty well integrated into galactic civilization, but they were still little populated, a little wild, and located on the edge of nowhere. It was in this outer region of the Thanium sector that Felucia lay. It was close to the Polemian trade route and the Shaltin tunnels, but it wasn't actually on any notable routes. It was simultaneously out of the way enough to receive very little scrutiny and close enough to major routes to be easily accessible, and this, together with its significance to the CIS, was a large part of what made Felucia a constant target during the Clone Wars. The Felucia system contained a single star, Felix, which was orbited by 8 planets. Felucia occupied the 4th orbit around Felix, with the scorched rock Kochia, the volcanic planet Brembo, and the terrestrial planet Albata Ing located closer to the Sun. Past Felucia were the gas giants Farasu, Yamaim, and Sutai, each accompanied by several moons, while the system's outermost planet was the ice ball Ime. Felucia itself was a habitable terrestrial planet with 2 barren moons, a 34-hour-long day, and a year of 231 local days. Felucia was a little small for a terrestrial planet with a diameter of 9,100 kilometers, and its gravity was correspondingly light, being just 75% of standard, which was light enough that those used to standard gravity would be able to notice. The planet had a breathable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, but contamination from fungal spores and poisons on some parts of Felucia meant that many beings required breath masks to breathe safely in some regions. Felucia had a greenhouse climate, meaning that it lacked polar ice caps and was hot and humid across most of its surface, and it apparently had a thin ozone layer, as the planet's surface was constantly being bombarded with well above average levels of ultraviolet radiation. Felucia's native creatures had adaptations to deal with this, but outsiders faced a serious risk of developing cancer while on the planet. Much of Felucia was covered by dark, shallow oceans choked with algae and spores, while the planet's scattered continents were almost entirely covered by a vast jungle, which was unlike any other in the galaxy. The jungles were dominated by enormous fungi, although there were some plant species on Felucia as well, and it was prowled by all sorts of unusual animals. Many Felucian plants and animals were translucent and vibrantly colored, such that when the sun was out, the Felucian jungles gleamed like stained glass. The Felucian jungles have been described as hallucinogenic in some sources, and it was one of the most unique, colorful, and visually distinctive environments in the galaxy. Felucia's many plants and fungi filled the air with spores and other byproducts. These gave Felucia's skies and appearance from orbit a sickly yellow hue, and they gave the entire planet a strong, overwhelming smell that the Essential Atlas characterizes as a mix of sweet nectar and rot. Felucia's jungles were dominated by a dense, closely interconnected life web which tied every living thing on Felucia together in a deep, quasi-symbiotic relationship. The whole planet was said to be like one living thing with a life force of its own that the natives could feel, and the sheer density of life on the planet made Felucia very strong in the Force. The Felucian Force Nexus was non-specific. It was generated by the jungle itself, not any one location or living thing, and though the Force was naturally light on Felucia, it wasn't strongly or exclusively light-sided. Mass death, or the influence of a strong Force user on Felucia, could sway the planet's Force Nexus toward the dark side, affecting the behavior of all Felucia's living things, and it could just as easily be swayed back toward the light. The sheer density of Felucia's fungal jungle, together with the prevalence of flesh-eating bacteria on many parts of the planet, meant that most of the planet was wild and unexplored, even after tens of thousands of years of settlement efforts. Felucia resisted colonization efforts and development fiercely, concentrating civilization on the planet to a few small regions. Even in those civilized areas, settlers had to contend with tropical diseases, dangerous bacteria, high UV, heat and humidity, and the difficulties of breathing the spore-choked air. As previously mentioned, Felucian flora was largely fungal in nature, although the planet still had many plants, as well as numerous species that blurred the lines between fungi, plants, and animals. The jungles were dominated by enormous, building-sized pitcher plants, towering multicolored mushrooms, bright blue fern trees, and many other tree-sized flora. Actual trees were very rare and generally unconventional, with Felucia hosting at least one species of enormous tree with long gnarled roots, though whether this was a true tree or a kind of fungus is unknown. These larger species provided support for horned fungi, slime molds, and phosphorescent lichens, while the undergrowth below was full of other flora, much of it carnivorous or otherwise dangerous. These included the Felucia spike plant, an orange-green plant that shot off salvos of spikes at creatures that got too close, blue flowering puffballs, which released toxic pollen that caused nerve damage in most species, Felucian spore plants, which released toxic or even explosive spores, and carnivorous flowers that hunted prey with sticky tendrils laced with honey. The bizarre, meat-eating and semi-sentient Yerdua poison spitter was firmly planted in the ground, but capable of moving its upper body around with animal-like speed, allowing it to spit globs of poison at anything that got too close with incredible accuracy. Other Felucian flora was much less harmful, including Nicelin, a highly valuable healing herb that was grown by some of Felucia's natives. Felucia's animals were even weirder than its riotous foliage. Many Felucian beasts were translucent and gelatinous, an adaptation that protected them against Felucia's high ultraviolet conditions, while others had similarly bizarre but very different adaptations. Felucia's jungle rivers and warm lagoons were full of thrashing tube worms and flat-backed, hard-shelled creatures that the Jungle Felucians used as living boats. Its skies swarmed with colourful, translucent prism-shaped birds which hunted for airborne seeds, as well as black, short-winged flying mantas. Felucian rippers, a deadly predator species with wide bodies and jagged teeth, lived in shallow rivers but hunted in the jungle canopy. They were capable of flight and tended to fly low, swooping down to bite off the heads of prey species. Alongside small mammalian cat bunnies, Felucia's jungles were stalked by bipedal, semi-sentient, force-sensitive predators called Katen, which used the force to appear friendly to lure in prey, as well as many kinds of gastropods. There was the slimy, hard-shelled Felucian snail, the spiny, cave-dwelling Felucian slug, and the jellygrub, also known as the Felucia ground beetle. This large, lava-like creature had translucent skin and a gelatinous appearance, resembling a mangled gummy bear more than anything else. The jellygrub was 4 meters long, had 5 pairs of legs, and was herbivorous and largely docile. It exuded adhesive slime, which allowed it to climb up steep cliffs, and it primarily ate lichen, from which it metabolized UV filtering chemicals that protected it from Felucia's harsh sunlight. The jellygrub itself was actually just the larval form of the hard-shelled Felucia ground beetle, but the larvae were the most valued by Felucia's natives and settlers alike, as they were easily domesticated and made loyal, dependable mounts. Felucia's jungles were also home to a host of species imported from other planets. These included the Timus, a docile beast of burden common to many planets, and several subspecies of rancor. Of these, the Felucian rancor was very similar to the mainline rancor species, and it was often domesticated by the native jungle Felucians, who used them as mounts and decorated their hides with luminescent substances. The larger bull rancor, which had 4 large tusks, pale skin, tough hides, and long tails, could also be found on Felucia. These rancors were more aggressive and solitary than ordinary Felucia rancors, and they were often found near the rancor graveyard, a site deep in the Felucian jungles where many rancors went to die, littering the area with skeletons. The multicolored, heavily mutated jungle rancor stalked Felucia's jungles as well. Felucia was also home to a few sarlaccs, including the largest known specimen in the galaxy, an enormous beast that lived in the ancient abyss. This massive creature was large enough to easily devour a rancor, and the jungle Felucians fed sacrifices to it on a regular basis. Felucia's most infamous imported creature, however, was the Acklay. Originally from Venduxa, these massive crustaceans were among the most feared predators in the galaxy, with hard carapaces, 6 spiky legs, and mouths full of long, sharp teeth. Felucia's population of Acklays had been released into the jungles by the Commerce Guild, where they quickly became well established. Felucia was home to 2 species that were known as Felucians, one of which was native and one of which was not. The more widely known of the 2, known simply as the Felucians, was the non-native one. These guys were actually related to the Gossams, and we'll talk about them later. Felucia's natives were instead known as Jungle Felucians, and they were a mystery to the outside galaxy. Their total population was unknown, and they were completely disconnected from the other peoples of Felucia, living in isolated tribal communities deep in the Felucian jungles. The Jungle Felucians were as bizarre as the rest of Felucia's wildlife, a deeply alien species relative to most others. They were humanoid amphibians, able to live and breathe both on land and underwater, and they were well adapted to life in Felucia's jungles. Jungle Felucians had an average height of 1.9 meters and an average weight of 90 kilograms. They had 2 sets of arms, one of which ended with webbed 4-fingered hands tipped with suction cups, and the other of which was smaller, featured 3 fingers, and sprouted from the other at the elbow. Felucians' heads consisted of thick clusters of long, flexible tendrils, with their mouths and eyes appearing as deep pits within them. Jungle Felucian's skin was tough and typically grey in colour, with blue, red, or yellow highlights, which served as camouflage in Felucia's jungles, and their eyes, which sometimes glowed red, were able to see in extremely dark conditions. Jungle Felucians were very tough, very agile, and very capable in combat, a threat to any who trespassed on their lands. On average, they had a lifespan of 85 years. They became adolescents at age 9, young adults at age 20, middle-aged at age 50, and elderly past the age of 70. As a species, the Jungle Felucians were strongly attuned to the Force, particularly to the Force nexus of the Felucian jungle. This close attunement to the life around them gave the Felucians a deep connection with their homeworld, and the Felucians were able to draw on this natural Force sensitivity to enhance their abilities in various ways, most notably by controlling their environment and the living creatures within it. Though the Jungle Felucians could be brutal at times, they were naturally aligned with the light side, albeit a wild form of it. When a Jungle Felucian fell to the dark side, it caused their whole appearance to change. Their face would become elongated, and the tendrils of their head would dry out and hang from the Felucian's skull. Jungle Felucians who fell to the dark side would descend into madness, and their kin traditionally brought them to the ancient abyss to be sacrificed to Felucia's great Sarlacc. The Jungle Felucians lived as hunter-gatherers and amassed into tribal cohorts that were all part of one planet-spanning tribe. Due to their strong attunement to the Force, Jungle Felucians could be unpredictable, wild, and primal, and this, plus their low technological level, led many outsiders to consider them primitive and beast-like. But they were actually very intelligent, and they merely preferred to live simple lives in harmony with their jungle home. Rather than trying and failing to tame Felucia, as the outsiders did, the Felucians chose to live as part of Felucia, and as a result, they thrived while settlement after settlement failed. The Jungle Felucians all shared a single culture as well as a single language, Felucian, which was guttural and somewhat animalistic. They wore simple clothing made of plant matter and bones, which they decorated with tassels and beadwork, and they also wore large ceremonial headdresses which obscured their faces. The Jungle Felucians ate the meat of Felucia's native creatures and mushrooms that they cultivated in their villages, and they had uses for a wide variety of Felucian flora, extracting poisons and medicines from many different species. They were also able to tame many of Felucia's beasts, including the Yerdua poison spitters, which were set up as living sentry turrets around the Felucian villages, and rancors, which the Jungle Felucians used as war mounts. Each cohort within the Jungle Felucians' planet-spanning tribe lived in a single village, which consisted of simple, bulbous huts formed from hollowed-out fungi. The Jungle Felucians were divided into castes, each of which had different specialities and roles in Felucian society. This included a farmer caste, which cultivated edible mushrooms, a scout caste, which served as hunters, and the warrior caste, which defended Felucian villages. Felucian warriors had blue markings, and they were raised to fight and die for the tribe, ambushing interlopers in the jungles and attacking enemies without mercy or fear. Felucian warriors could use the Force to protect themselves from incoming fire, to conjure explosive spheres of compressed air, and to imbue their chosen weapons, the Felucian skull blades, with the power to stand up to lightsaber strikes. Warriors were often led by Felucian shamans, a caste composed of those Jungle Felucians who were especially strong in the Force. Felucian shamans had red markings and served as priests for their people, guiding their use of the Force and steering them away from the dark side. It was the shamans who sacrificed Felucian Darksiders at the Ancient Abyss, fearful of what could happen if the dark side was allowed to corrupt Felucia's ecosystem. Shamans used the Force to treat infections, to heal wounds, to communicate telepathically, to inflict illness on their enemies, and to create Force auras that harmed those seeking to kill them. Felucian shamans often accompanied groups of warriors into battle, issuing commands via ceremonial horns and using the Force to both bolster the skills of their allies and harm their enemies. Shamans typically carried simple shields for defensive purposes, and they too carried skull blades into battle, although they used their blades more for ritual purposes than combat. The most feared Felucian caste was the Felucian chieftains, who were taller and tougher than other Felucians. Distinguished by yellow markings, Felucian chieftains were slower but stronger than Felucian warriors, and they channeled the Force through imposing ceremonial staffs. They wore heavy armor and bore large shields, making them even more resilient. Chieftains led their warriors into battle, acting as berserkers in encounters with the enemy, and they also served as the day-to-day leaders of the Jungle Felucians, ruling over the tribe's villages. The Jungle Felucians originally lived all across Felucia, but they were driven from many parts of the planet by the arrival of settlers. The Jungle Felucians didn't really care for these colonists, but they usually only attacked settlements when the settlers there cut off the trade routes between native villages. They did, however, attack colonists that ventured into their territory, which lay in the densest depths of Felucia's jungles, far from the planet's major settlements. Few Jungle Felucians ever left Felucia or made extensive contact with the planet's settlers. The Felucians' connection to the jungles was such that they were generally uninterested in leaving them, and they typically preferred to keep to themselves. But the Jungle Felucians weren't outright xenophobic, and they were known to give shelter to non-Felucians that sought refuge among their tribe. For untold millennia, the Jungle Felucians had Felucia to themselves, living in harmony with its other living creatures, undisturbed by outsiders. But in 27,000 BBY, at a time when the galaxy was ruled by the Rakatan Infinite Empire, the Felucian seclusion was brought to an end, not by the Rakata, but by the Gossams. Hailing from the planet Castel in the colonies, the Gossams were one of several species that were experimenting with interstellar colonization at this time, and they had managed to develop their own form of FTL technology, the unstable and unpredictable tumble drive. Essentially a more primitive and dangerous form of the hyperdrive, the tumble drive nonetheless allowed a group of Gossam explorers, the Gossam Courivers, to strike out from Castel into the depths of the galaxy. Possibly following what would later become the Plemian trade route, the Courivers were able to get from Castel and the colonies all the way to Felucia in the Outer Rim, where the Gossams attempted to establish settlements. The Gossam Courivers claimed Felucia as Gossam land, and they attempted to clear parts of Felucia's jungles to build settlements. This earned the Gossams the ire of the Jungle Felucians, of course, who attacked the Gossams' early settlements, destroying some and besieging the rest. As increasingly more colonists arrived, however, the Felucians were forced to give up on driving them off completely. They retreated deep into Felucia's jungles, and from that point forward, they would only attack the Gossam colonies if they got too close to their villages. This didn't happen often, as the Gossams weren't keen to get that deep into the Felucian jungle. Even in the more lightly forested parts of the planet, the Gossams had a hard time getting a foothold, as Felucia's dense forests and many dangerous creatures made development expensive and dangerous. Eventually, however, the Gossams were able to establish a few footholds on Felucia, which became permanent settlements. Felucia became the Gossams' first colony world, but it also remained one of their least populous due to the difficulty of developing it. Felucia essentially became an exotic resort world for the Gossams, a place where Castell's wealthy could come for a change of scenery in fortified jungle resorts, while servants tended to their needs and kept the colonies running. Felucia would nominally remain a Gossam possession for the next 2,000 years, but the planet came under new management in 25,126 BBY. The year before, the nearby Tyon cluster had been united under the rule of the pirate king Zim the Despot, who was determined to make Tyon into the core of a great empire. Zim's armies began sweeping out of the Tyon cluster, conquering everything in their path. From their staging ground on the Thanium, just past the Tyon cluster's edge, the Tynese began conquering everything between their homeworlds and the Radama Void, and Felucia, which the Tynese knew as Galuch, was one of their first conquests. Galuch became one of hundreds of Tynese outposts in the Thanium worlds, a vast outlying region of Zim's empire that became the Empire's Warforge. It's unknown if the Tynese actually bothered to occupy Galuch's Gossam colonies or establish their own settlements, or if they just nominally claimed the planet as a mustering ground. If there was ever any Tynese presence on the planet's surface, all trace of it was erased by the march of history. If the Tynese did occupy Galuch, the planet's Gossam colonists would have been enslaved, driven off, or exterminated. The planet would have been lost to the Gossams, and it would have stayed that way for some time. While Zim's empire ultimately only lasted for a few decades, Galuch remained under Tynese control after it splintered, coming under the rule of the Thanium Dominion, a rump state that controlled the portions of the Thanium worlds closest to the Tyon cluster. The Thanium Dominion only ceased to exist circa 24,000 BBY, around the time of the Tynese War between the Galactic Republic and the other Tynese states. Following the war, the Tyon cluster was annexed by the Republic, and the former Thanium Dominion, Felucia included, was incorporated into the Republic by 20,000 BBY. By that point, the Gossams, who were now part of the Republic, had regained control of their former colony. This control was tenuous, however, and it waxed and waned over the millennia of Republic history. Successive waves of Gossam colonists set up shop on Felucia, rebuilt old settlements or established new ones, had occasional conflicts with the Jungle Felucians, and eventually left, with the successful colonization waves typically using Felucia as an exotic resort, as the planet's original colonists had. Through it all, Felucia remained an obscure planet, a little-known Republic territory and dependency of Castell rather than a full Republic member. It was only after the end of the New Sith Wars in 1000 BBY, when the Gossam colonies finally began expanding into cities and larger settlements, that Felucia really started to come into its own. By the time of the Clone Wars, Felucia finally had an established settler population, and it had ceased to be a dependency of Castell, developing its own society and economy. By this point in time, Felucia had a settler population of 425 million, with the population of the Jungle Felucians being unknown. Of this total, 70% of the population consisted of the non-native Felucian species, while 20% consisted of Gossams and 10% was a diverse mix of other species. These settlers primarily spoke Galactic Basic and the Gossam language, and though the Felucians typically lived separately from the other settlers, they interacted with them regularly and played a key role in Felucia's economy. We'll start by discussing the non-native Felucians, who you might remember from Star Wars: The Clone Wars. These Felucians were short, reptilian humanoids, and they were very similar in appearance to the Gossams, to whom they were closely related. It's unknown how exactly the Felucians and Gossams were related, but the most likely explanation is that the Felucians were descended from a Gossam colony wave that was cut off from the Gossam homeworld of Castell, leading its colonists to eventually diverge into a different species, similar to how the Nemoidians diverged from the Duros. The Felucians did have notable physiological differences from the Gossams. They appeared to have stockier legs and plantigrade rather than digitigrade feet, and they had 3 fingers on each hand instead of 2, and they had longer squatter heads with different features. Their mouths were larger, their nostrils were more pronounced, their eyes were more deep set, they lacked the Gossams' ears, and they had several ridges of short plates along the back of their heads that the Gossams lacked. Felucians averaged 1.4 meters in height, making them a little taller on average than the Gossams. They typically had red eyes, and their skin could be orange, pink, yellow, or green, in contrast to the deeper shades of Gossam's skin. Despite all these differences though, the evolutionary links between the Felucians and the Gossams are plainly visible, and the biggest differences between the two species were cultural. While the Gossams were cunning, highly individualistic, and obsessed with appearance and status, the Felucians were much meeker and more community-centric, and they typically lived simple lives in small, largely egalitarian farming villages. Many Felucian villages, such as the village of Akira, grew the healing herb Nicelin, while others cultivated other native crops. The Felucians generally weren't subsistence farmers, rather they grew cash crops to trade for essentials. Felucian farming villages were scattered across a wide swath of Felucia, typically in clearings or less dense parts of the jungles, far from the villages of the Jungle Felucians. Most Felucian villages were farmers, and those that weren't were usually traders. The Felucian villages coexisted pretty well with Felucia's largest colonies, with the other two regularly trading with one another. These colonies were largely populated and run by the Gossams, though many Felucians lived in them as well. The Gossams were the most populous non-Felucian species on Felucia, though there were many other immigrant species in their colonies as well. The Felucian colonies were home to substantial numbers of Ithorians, Twi'leks, and humans, though Gossams typically held all positions of power in these settlements. By the time of the Clone Wars, almost all of these colonists worked for the Commerce Guild. The Commerce Guild had first come to Felucia during the early Golden Age of the Republic, and by 700 BBY, the guild legally owned the entire planet, administering all of its colonies directly. The Commerce Guild built up Felucia's colonies into full-size cities, establishing all sorts of support infrastructure around them, and it ended Felucia's dependence on Castell. The guild then relocated its corporate headquarters to the planet, and it built many other private facilities, including military installations out in the Felucian wilderness. Under guild rule, Felucia's largest cities were each home to millions of colonists, the vast majority of whom served the Commerce Guild as laborers maintaining the settlements or extracting botanical products from the jungles, merchants managing trade to and from Felucia, or administrative personnel that worked in the guild's headquarters. Not much is known about the conditions for guild employees on Felucia, but considering that workers on other planets the Commerce Guild owned were usually underpaid, overworked, denied unionization and other labor rights, and gunned down if they went on strike, the Felucian colonists probably weren't living large. The guild most likely operated Felucia's cities as company towns, as they owned everything there anyway. There were at least 4 large cities on Felucia by the time of the Clone Wars, all Commerce Guild run and home to major water treatment plants, among other facilities. These included Hargao, Nyango, Jiaozi, and the planetary capital, the city of Kuei Tiao. The Commerce Guild had its headquarters in a large fortified compound just outside of Kuei Tiao, a short speeder ride away from the guild's executive landing platform in the city. During the Clone Wars, Commerce Guild Presidente, Shu Mei, turned this compound into her own personal stronghold, fortifying the region around Kuei-Tiao and basing a massive droid army at the city. The Commerce Guild had many other isolated outposts scattered throughout Felucia's jungles, most of them fortified military bases home to droid units from the Commerce Guild punitive security forces. The guild also maintained a fortified prison, the Nikko detention facility, deep in the jungles, and its spider droids ran regular patrols through the jungles around guild cities, driving the Jungle Felucians even farther away. Under the Commerce Guild, Felucia primarily exported various botanical products harvested from the planet's jungles. Many of these, especially the healing herb Nicelin, were grown in the Felucian farming villages and sold to the Commerce Guild. The guild also harvested a variety of exotic botanicals themselves, especially those with uses as medicine or as biotoxins, and it oversaw all exports of these compounds from Felucia. In turn, the Commerce Guild imported foodstuffs, fuel, and various forms of high technology, some of which it sold to the workers in guild cities, and some of which it traded to the Felucian farming villages. On paper, Felucia was an entirely corporate-administered planet, but in practice, this only applied to the major colonies and Commerce Guild bases. The Jungle Felucian tribe was obviously independent, and so were the Felucian farming villages, which had an understanding with the guild but didn't answer to them directly. There were also other independent villages scattered throughout the Felucian wilderness that were actively hostile to the Commerce Guild. These settlements were established by exiles and refugees from the guild cities that, for one reason or another, opposed Commerce Guild rule. A few were simply criminal enclaves, while others were populated by workers that had fled from the guild city's harsh working conditions, or by fugitive labor organizers that had been forced to flee their homes for trying to unionize guild workers. These anti-Commerce Guild communities fiercely resisted when the guild attempted to encroach on their homes, but they generally lacked the numbers to strike back against the guild and its droid armies. By the final decades of the Republic, Felucia was becoming increasingly prominent due to its role as the Commerce Guild headquarters, though it was still rarely visited by those not associated with the guild. In 53 BBY, Felucia was granted full membership into the Republic, despite objections that it was a mere corporate client world. It didn't stay a Republic member world for very long, however. When the Commerce Guild threw its lot in with the Confederacy of Independent Systems just before the Battle of Geonosis, Felucia seceded along with the rest of the Thanium sector. Felucia became a separatist stronghold world, as well as a repeated target for Republic forces. Unlike many other separatist strongholds in its region of space, Felucia wasn't an industrial world, and it had little inherent value for the CIS military. However, because the Commerce Guild headquarters was located on Felucia, the planet was heavily fortified, becoming one of the Confederacy's most well-defended worlds. Early in the war, while the Separatists were still consolidating their territory in the region, Shu Mei established a massive droid army on Felucia and a naval blockade in orbit, commanded from the carrier/destroyer Nihilist. By the end of 22 BBY, Felucia was well defended, and Separatist victories in the northern slice had ensured that it was far from the front lines. However, while Felucia was far from Republic space, it lay fairly close to a region of unclaimed space in the heart of the Transhidian, where the Republic had a transient military presence. This allowed the Republic to carry out repeated attacks on Felucia, which quickly became a Republic priority target, both due to it housing the Commerce Guild's headquarters and due to its close proximity to vital hyperspace routes that the Republic could use to advance further into the Confederacy's core territories. There were at least 7 engagements between Loyalist and Separatist forces on Felucia over the course of the Clone Wars, including no less than 4 full-scale battles. The first Battle of Felucia took place in early 21 BBY, when a Republic task force under Jedi General Plo Koon broke through Felucia's orbital defenses. The 104th Battalion established a beachhead on Felucia, and the Republic even deployed a medical station above the planet, intending to use Felucia as a stepping stone for campaigns across the Thanium sector. However, General Grievous soon led a fleet to Felucia to reinforce the Commerce Guild's defense forces, and even though the Republic sent its own reinforcements under Generals Kenobi and Skywalker, Loyalist forces were quickly overrun. The Republic was driven from Felucia, suffering heavy casualties in the process, and Grievous destroyed the Felucia medical station as well. The CIS victory brought an end to the Republic's incursions into the Thanium sector, at least for a time. Later, in 21 BBY, in the Second Battle of Felucia, Republic forces under Generals Koon and Skywalker once again attempted to take the planet, and initially, they saw much more success. Even as General Grievous deployed reinforcements to Felucia to strengthen its defenses, Republic forces seized a Separatist command base, again gaining a foothold on the planet. However, this didn't last, and Republic forces were eventually driven from Felucia once more. The whole pattern repeated itself in the Third Battle of Felucia in early 20 BBY. These repeated Republic incursions failed to drive the Confederacy from Felucia, but they did weaken the Commerce Guild's grip on the planet. Many of the outlying Felucian communities aided Republic forces by sending them guides and scouts, while the renegade villages, deep in Felucia's jungles, began a campaign of open rebellion against the Guild in 20 BBY, pushing Shu Mei to order her forces to start eliminating the remote renegade villages with the chemical weapon Trihexalon. All the while, the Republic continued sending small units to Felucia to destroy the odd Separatist military base, further weakening the Guild's grip on the planet. By the start of the Outer Rim sieges at the end of 20 BBY, Felucia was still firmly under Separatist control, but the Republic was starting to get more serious about taking the planet. Loyalist military command designated the whole enclave of Separatist territory on the Outer Polemian as the Felucia Theater, and the Republic began preparing for a full-scale siege of the planet. But the Republic waited to actually attack Felucia. It wanted to wait until it could confirm that Shu Mei was on the planet, hoping to capture her along with the rest of the Commerce Guild's administration. It wasn't until early 19 BBY that a Jedi surveillance team spotted Shu Mei returning to her compound, barely managing to report this back to the Republic before being captured. With that, the Battle of Felucia, the last Battle of Felucia, began. This battle lasted for several months, and it was far larger than any of the prior Loyalist attempts to take the planet. By this point in the war, Felucia's defenses had been significantly worn down by rebellion and repeated Republic invasion, but the Confederacy still had a fleet in orbit and vast armies of battle droids on the surface, backed by Commerce Guild spider droids, other Separatist tank droid models, and AATs, plus several mercenary units and the Guild's feared Gossam commandos. In preparation for the siege, CIS forces had entrenched deep in Felucia's jungles and in the regions around the planet's cities, and Shu Mei had ordered wild Acklays to be released into the jungles as well. But by this stage of the war, the Republic was playing for keeps as well, and Felucia's administrators knew how the siege was likely to end. They never had any illusions of victory. Instead, Shu Mei had ordered them to make the siege as costly as possible for the Republic. Despite a fierce resistance, the Republic's initial assault successfully broke the Confederacy's defensive blockade over Felucia, and the Republic landed the 182nd Legion on Felucia's surface. But the 182nd quickly found itself out of its depth in Felucia's jungles, and amidst constant ambushes and Acklay attacks, the entire unit was wiped out. The Republic sent in the 501st next, and despite heavy casualties, they successfully established a staging ground in the Felucian jungles. With this beachhead secured, a full-scale Republic invasion of Felucia could begin. At around this time, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine designated Felucia, Megiddo, and Seleucami the primary targets of the Outer Rim sieges, calling them a triad of evil and dispatching a large part of Coruscant's defense fleet to their respective theaters. The fleet assigned to Felucia, led by the Star Destroyer Intrepid, quickly wiped out what was left of the planet's defense fleet, allowing the 327th Star Corps, led by Jedi General Aayla Secura, to deploy to the planet's surface. Secura and her forces began by storming the Nikko detention facility, from which they rescued the Jedi surveillance team the Commerce Guild had previously captured. From there, while the Battle of Coruscant raged elsewhere in the galaxy, the 327th marched on Kuei Tio, capturing the Felucian capital and the Commerce Guild's headquarters. But Secura and her men found the guild compound deserted. Shu Mei had fled Felucia days prior to rendezvous with the rest of the Separatist Council, and the fortress had been evacuated, filled with toxins and rigged with explosives. Secura and her troops were able to escape the destruction of Shu Mei's compound, but they soon learned that the explosion was only part of the trap Mei had laid. The destruction of the compound had also released deadly toxins into Felucia's water supply, and the Commerce Guild had rigged the water distribution plants elsewhere on the planet to spread this toxin throughout Felucia's water table. As a last act of spite, Shu Mei planned to poison the entire planet, killing its entire colonist population. One of the Padawans assigned to the mission estimated that the Jedi had just 4 days to prevent the toxins from spreading. As Republic reinforcements arrived on the planet, Secura and the other Jedi devised a desperate plan to save Felucia. They needed to capture the water distribution plants in 3 cities in order to stop Mei's contingency, and the 327th divided its forces to go after all of them simultaneously. One detachment would go after Hargao, the Padawans would lead another to Jiaozi, while Secura herself would lead the rest to Niango. Jiaozi fell first, and its water distribution system was secured. However, while the other units were still en route to their objective, Order 66 was issued. Commander Bly and his men executed General Secura and took over the Niango assault, while Lieutenant Gale took over the Hargao assault. The clones at Jiaozi turned on the Padawans, but the young Jedi had been alerted to their betrayal after witnessing Aayla Secura's death through a clone helmet cam, and the Padawans were able to escape. With the Jedi dead or missing, the 327th proceeded to take Hargao and Niango, foiling Shu Mei's plan to poison the planet, and not long afterwards, all remaining droid forces on Felucia were remotely deactivated. The Republic, now the Galactic Empire, seized the Commerce Guild's remaining installations on Felucia, and the planet came under Imperial rule. All told, the Clone Wars were devastating for Felucia. Large parts of the jungles were laid waste by the fighting, and many settlements had been razed or otherwise damaged. The sheer amount of carnage from the various battles on Felucia darkened the Force nexus on the planet, drawing some of the Jungle Felucians dangerously close to the dark side. The end of the Clone Wars didn't improve things all that much, as Felucia came under Imperial occupation. Many separatist dead-enders, including former Commerce Guild administrators, military commanders, and Gossam settlers, fled into the jungles to escape Imperial forces. Most of these joined the outlaw townships of labor organizers, criminals, and refugees that the Guild had previously persecuted, where some of them attempted to start anti-imperial resistance movements, while a few, including CIS Major Vazos Mandrake, sought refuge with the Jungle Felucians, who welcomed them into their tribe. 2 Jedi, the Jedi Master Shakti and the Padawan Maris Brood, also sought refuge in Felucia's jungles, becoming powerful chieftains of the Jungle Felucians. Shakti especially was revered by the Felucians, as she helped them avoid falling to the dark side, taught them new Force techniques to defend themselves with, and helped them repair the damage that had been done to Felucia's ecosystem. Felucia's colonies, meanwhile, remained under Imperial control. The Empire established a permanent military garrison in Kuei Tio and built a few facilities out in the jungles, including a scattering of military bases and a prison known as the Vanishing Place, but apart from that, its presence on Felucia was fairly limited. After the major separatist holdouts on the planet were wiped out, much of the Imperial occupation force withdrew from Felucia, and the Imperials that remained were mostly there for biological weapons research and for rounding up Gossam colonists to sell into slavery. In 3 BBY, just prior to the outbreak of the Galactic Civil War, Darth Vader dispatched his secret apprentice, Starkiller, to Felucia, where he was to assassinate Shaak Ti. Starkiller successfully killed the exiled Jedi Master, which had dire consequences for Felucia. Maris Brood succumbed to the dark side after Ti's death, and her fall corrupted the Force Nexus on Felucia as well as the Jungle Felucians. Fortunately, Starkiller came to Felucia the next year, and he was able to bring Maris back from the dark side, allowing Felucia to shift back to the light. Apart from these missions, the early years of the Galactic Civil War largely ignored Felucia. After the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY, Felucia fell within the territory of the Imperial warlord Zinj, but Zinj's forces had no known presence on the planet. After Zinj's death and the fragmentation of his empire in 8 ABY, Felucia and the surrounding space became contested between the Empire, the New Republic, and Imperial warlords, becoming known as the Borderlands. Eventually, however, Felucia came under New Republic rule. It remained under New Republic rule until the Yuuzhan Vong War, in which it was conquered by the extragalactic invaders before eventually being liberated. After the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, Felucia was settled by tribes of Ithorians fleeing the Vong's destruction of their homeworld, seeking a jungle world that reminded them of home. Through it all, Felucia remained largely unchanged. So, that's the full story of Felucia, another of the Star Wars galaxy's worst possible holiday destinations. But what do you think? Are there other planets you'd like us to cover in depth? Let us know in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.